Directors, managers, CEOs, owners, you're going to want to pay attention to this because this is something that every one of you are going to run into at some point. Today, we're talking about the issues with staffing and how to actually decide who your most valuable coaches are. Now, before we get started, if you haven't watched the stuff that I did in the very first video about figuring out who it is that you're supposed to be serving in the first place, you're going to want to watch that because this is going to cover some things that I referenced in that video. But without talking too much, we're actually going to be using the whiteboard to lay out a couple things that you really need to start paying attention to. So let's get started. We are going to be going over two metrics, and I'm going to make sure that you understand them because they're going to be super basic. The first one is probably the most important one before we even get to the value of the coach. This is something that the Navy SEALs came up with, which I actually started to apply into the businesses that I consult with, and it's called the Skill Trust Matrix. So the Navy SEAls came up with this, and this is basically a way that they decide they even want somebody on their team. Now, if we were to look at this as a graph, we would have skill on this side, and we would have trust on this side. I'm going to make this really fast. So obviously, ideally, we want somebody of high skill and somebody of high trust. So we want somebody that's located here. But we can't always get this person. Ideally, we do want to have that person. And when it comes to the Navy SEALs, for example, we're talking about the people that are the best of the best of the best. And then once they've got like 10 or 15 people that are the best of the best of the best, then they go into this thing and they say, if we can't have somebody of the highest skill, meaning somebody that's up here, what we definitely don't want to do is have somebody of the lowest trust and highest skill. What we want to do is we'd actually take somebody of medium skill, but high trust. And this looks very simple on paper, but the thing is we have a ton of metrics on how to test or judge how skilled somebody is, but we really struggle to actually test and do any type of quantification on how much we trust somebody in our facility. And we've all had coaches or seen coaches that are taking money off the top, that take students outside when the weather gets nice, and then they take money and pocket it for themselves rather than helping the business. This is one of those things that you really want to pay attention to. Now, in terms of the skill itself, if we look back at the video we did in the very beginning where we're talking about who we want to identify as our ideal customer, the skill is going to be based on who that person is. But what we want to make sure of is that we're really quantifying how much we can trust those people. And it's okay to have somebody of medium skill, but really high trust, more so than it's okay to have somebody of really high skill, but very low trust. And a lot of times we are bringing staff members on to our facility because we hear that they play Division I tennis, that they've made a whole bunch of high-level players, and we don't really vet the things that are the metrics behind that. What we don't find out is that out of the 100 people this person worked with, 20 of them filed complaints about the person's attitude on court. 30 of them left the building overall, and then 10 of them decided to stay and actually became good players. So we want to make sure that we're actually looking at how much we can trust them with our program. And also what they found out is that this person tends to be more of a toxic work environment because they feel like they're better than everybody else, and they don't really put that trust and energy into the people around them. They're more self-centered, and as a result, the people around them tend to work at a lower capacity as well. So we want to make sure before we even get started with the other thing we're talking about that we bring in somebody of high skill and high trust, but if we have to give up one, it's okay to give up a little bit of the skill to make sure that we have a person that we can still trust with our program. All right, so the board is now clear and we can talk about the 5 skills that we actually need to look at with our coaches to figure out how much of a value they bring to our facility. When we look at our staff, there are going to be 5 metrics that we want to judge the person off of, whether they're valuable to our facility. The first one, most owners, managers, and CEOs know. We want to look at progression. So this is simply a coach's ability to move a player forward through the program. So if we look at levels of your players, we got level 1 through level 10. Can we get them to go level 1, 2, 3, all the way through the program? Now, subtext to this one is progression does not always mean person can get from level 1 all the way to level 10. What it means is wherever you place them in the program, they understand how to move the needle forward. So if you have a ground level coach that's really good at getting the basics instilled in somebody, that's still very valuable. But a lot of times we look at that, again, high level performance coach and we go, well, this person must be super, super valuable because they've made all these high performance players. But what you usually fail to find out is that they actually struggle with this area of the program. So just be aware of where the value is in your program when we talk about who you're catering to. If you're building a performance program, then your progression coach needs to be more well-versed in the higher levels of progression. And if you build a rec program or a grassroots program, your coaches need to be very, very good at the progression of the lower level, because not everybody's going to want to be here, but we're trying to get people buy into the tennis as a sport. So your progression coaches are going to be super valuable. Just figure out which one it is that you care the most about. Now, the next one, super obvious, we're looking at retention. A coach's ability to keep a player in the program. Okay? Now, retention, this one is a really tricky metric to pay attention to, because sometimes if you're not doing the deep work, you actually will confuse these two things. And I'm telling you this because I've done it. When I say you confuse it, I don't mean that you don't know which is which. What I mean is you don't know where to give the attention. So I'll give you an example of something that actually happened to me when I was directing a facility. I had to look deeper into the numbers to figure it out, but we had a coach that was killing it on the retention numbers. They always had roughly about 12 to 15 people in their class every session. No matter what happened, they always did a good job there. Now, that sounds great for the numbers of the business because you can guarantee that that person is doing a solid job. What we didn't pay attention to at first, and I actually went back in and noticed it, then I had to have a meeting with the coach, is this coach was actually losing about 4 to 5 people every session. So out of the 5 sessions that we had, we were losing 4 to 5 people every time. And what that meant was we were losing 20 to 25 people per year in this coach's class. Now, the reason why their retention numbers seemed to not raise an alarm is because the number was consistent. You had 12 to 15 people every time. What it actually was our progression coach filling that class constantly. And it was a combination of the progression coach doing a good job and the marketing team just doing a good job of bringing people into the building. So marketing was filling up the level 1 class. The level 1 class was filling up the level 2 class. And then the level 2 class was getting rid of 4 to 5 people every session. So just pay attention to that, because not all the time when you're looking at your progression numbers, do those things actually match. So when we look at progression, we want to make sure that we are making sure that we look at the names or whatever it is that you use to identify the player, and then check your retention numbers, because retention is super important. The next one we want to look at is identification. Now, what identification is, it sounds pretty simple, but a coach's ability to take a player and just put them in the right basket in the program. So this is a junior player, they go here. This is an adult, they go here. This is a high performance player, they go here. I know so many coaches that do not do this well. And what ends up happening, kind of similar to retention, but it's kind of a dragging metric, is if a player gets misidentified too many times, they will leave the program. So this literally happened about 2 weeks ago. I was dealing with a coach and I'm dealing with an upset parent. And when I was in the meeting, the parent said, well, we came in and the coach told us to go to class A. I'm just going to, for the sake of the story, go to class A. Now, I could have looked at that kid for 5 seconds and said, class A doesn't fit. But they went to class A for a week. Now, they were in class A. They were completely misleveled. They were way below that level. So the coach was looking at how old they were. But in terms of skill, they didn't fit there. So then the coach told them, oh, you should go to class B. Now, the problem with class B was the right skill level, but the wrong age. He sent them to a 10 and under class that had her skill level. So she went from wrong to wrong again. And then the parent, after changing their schedule twice, was then told go to class C. And you know what she did? She called me because she was upset that she had to change her schedule and her work pickup and all that stuff 2 times before she was put in the right place. And I was the one who put her in class C. And the reason why I had to do it was because at that point, you can't trust the opinion of that coach that they were listening to. They've been mislabeled twice. And what ends up happening is enough bad experiences make somebody just look for somebody that knows what they're talking about. So even though this doesn't seem like something that's super important as to the on-court portion, a lot of times you have coaches that misidentify players and automatically start off with a negative connotation to the program. Also, misidentification can go to your front desk and administrative staff as well. So just make sure you're aware that identification isn't always on the coaches. Sometimes people at the front desk are telling people the wrong information. So you want to make sure you fill the hole in that bucket if that is where it's happening. Now, let's move on to the last two because we're going to get this done really quickly. The next one is activation. Now, activation is a critical one because this is a combination of multiple skills. Now, activation is nothing more than getting a player to identify as being a tennis player. We've all had multi-sport players that are in our program and they are here for a session and then they go to soccer, then they go to softball, then they go to basketball, then they come back to tennis and they can't figure out why they're not getting any better. A coach's ability to activate a player is a systematic thing. Now, this is a metric that I actually started tracking in a lot of facilities that I consult with. Now, when it comes to activation, what you want to do is you want to have a very laid out pathway of your player. So let's just give 3 players here. 1, 2, and 3. Now, what you want to do is you want to have a system that all these players file through, and they go to here, then they go to here, then they go to here. Now, what you want to track is if at the minimum you lose 2 players at a specific stage, then you have an activation issue because this player is sticking in the program and these 2 players are leaving. Now, if these 2 players leave or they fail to continue with whatever it is that you told them to do, you have a system issue because you want to make sure these people go through. And when we talk about activation, we want to look at what point in the program is this person all of a sudden a little bit more switched on. And then we say, okay, at stage 3, this player got switched on. At stage 3 here, this player also did it. So we need to start putting more priority into this stage because this seems to be where players are doing the most when it comes to our program. And then once you have a systematized thing, then identify what that critical area is. It might be a way that you handle your offers. It might be a class that you added that all of a sudden people started really getting involved in. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that once you've labeled out what this activation point is, then you want to just systematize it and get your coaches to push players to get to that point as quickly as possible. And then you'll have higher conversion rates of activated players, which means they are less likely to leave. And your program becomes more what I call sticky. That means people are there and they don't want to go somewhere else. Even if they're only doing one thing all year is better than one thing for one session. So your club actually makes more money just because somebody doesn't leave, even if they only do one thing. Now, the last one is Ascension. Ascension is probably one of my favorites because it is the most profitable portion of any program and most people do not track what causes it. So if we look at all this stuff, these are the 5 skills. Ascension is a coach's ability to make a player go from doing one thing to 2 things, and so forth and so on. So the player is ascending in value in the program for whatever reason. Now, when it comes to me, I'm pretty good at all of these things, but when I first got into coaching, I thought this was the only thing that matters. I only got good at these as I started to become more business-minded and become more system-focused. Now, on the Ascension side, I'm just going to use my own numbers at the facilities that I've worked at. I was their highest performing coach across the board, but this is where I really shined when it came to comparison to other coaches. And here's what I mean. The average player at my program, when I was doing the things I was doing, the average player was worth about $2,000, maybe $1,500, depending on where they were and how much they were doing. Now, this is a player that has minimal activation, like they're doing all the sessions, they might partake in a league or something like that. And for me, my players were worth an average of $15,000 to $12,000 per year, and I had a lot of players that I was working with. And this is a huge metric when it comes to looking at your coaches, because the next coach under me who had private students, who had regular occurrences, Their highest valued student was $5,000. So I had made players ascend to a point where they were worth 3 times as much as the next highest coach's students. Now, if you look at that across the board and also extrapolate that I was working with 40 to 50 people per year, and I was doing $15,000 to $12,000 per person, the amount of money that the facility was making was astronomically higher than the next coach who was doing $5K at the most, and they were working with about 20 students. And then again, this is the next highest coach. So there were about 3 coaches under there that were doing less and less and less. So the progression, retention, identification, activation, and ascension, they all work together. But whenever you have a coach, you want to figure out where they're most valuable in your program, and then you want to create systems that actually highlight those things. Now, to tie it all together, when we're looking at which coach is most valuable to your program, the only thing you have to do is figure out what type of program are you doing. If your retention numbers are your biggest thing that you care about, then you're probably in more of a rec program or more of a club environment where you're just trying to have high numbers, whereas progression is mostly attributed to academies, depending on what you do. Activation, that just is something that kind of works in tandem with everything else. Ascension is based on usually private facilities because they have to make sure they're maintaining the numbers. But all these things are not inherently identified with one facility over another. You just need to make sure which of your coaches is shining at one of these things and put them in a place or copy the systems that they have in order to use these things to best help your facility. It doesn't matter what it is. The main thing is you want to make sure that your coach is in the best place to do the thing that's going to help your facility the most, and then you're going to have a very thriving business. But that's going to wrap up today's video. Hopefully this all made sense to you. I try to keep it as simple as possible. I will do some more in-depth things in terms of making these things make more sense to people, but this is something you can immediately take and look at your facility, look at your staff, and start to kind of put them into the bubbles that fit your facility the most. And if it is something that is drastically out of line, it tells you if you need to keep that person on staff, even if they are a good coach. For example, going back to our trust and our skill thing, there might be somebody that has a high level of skill in one of these things, but the level of trust isn't there. Or they might have a high level of trust in the program, but you can't really rely on them for progression or retention. They don't do a good job identifying people. They're kind of just a placeholder. And you need coaches that are like that, but you can't give them any responsibility. Way too often I see coaches that are responsible for things that they're not good at, or they're not responsible for things that they would be very valuable to the facility in. So let's make sure that as you go through your business and you start to apply these things, just be aware that you have to take time to figure out these things. Don't just look at a coach and say, that's what they do. You have to look at the numbers, look at the data, because data is a thing that is a big driving force. And a lot of times people just go off of intuition. But that's going to wrap up today's video. I will see you guys in the next one. We'll go a little bit deeper into some of these tactical topics, but I'll catch you guys in the next video.